Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan McIntosh. I'm the director of Scientia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this lecture in our year-long series on failure. We're very glad to see you all here. Thank you for coming out, especially on such a beautiful day. Failure has been a very rich theme for us this year. We've looked at failures of visual perception, voting machine failures, medical error, and failure to attain hoped-for levels of personalized medicine. In each case, some aspect of success or the insight leading to success was rooted in failure, in understanding what went wrong, what didn't work as expected, what factors contributed to failure in particular circumstances. Today's lecture takes us to an entirely different lens on failure, that of the poetics of failure, in which the inevitable failure of representation in art lies at the heart of its power to create the perception of truth and beauty. We are delighted beyond words to have as our lecturer today Deborah Harter, Associate Professor of French Studies, who comes to us as a survivor of a near-death experience in December that has given her new perspectives on truth, beauty, and the nature of the truly important things in life, one of which has been the intellectual journey she's undertaken in preparing this lecture. We are exceptionally fortunate that she's chosen to pursue this in the wake of her accident. Deborah holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California at Berkeley and has been the recipient of research fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Association of University Women, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley, and the Center for the Study of Cultures here at Rice. While at Rice, Dr. Harter has received numerous awards for her teaching, including the Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Prize, 2 George R. Brown Prizes for Superior Teaching, and the Allison Sarafim Distinguished Teaching Professorship. She's been honored twice with the Impact Award for her contributions to women at Rice, and in 2008 was named by the Student Association Faculty Mentor of the Year. She's the author of Bodies and Pieces, Fantastic Narrative in the Poetics of the Fragment, published by Stanford University Press in 1996, and is currently writing a study of madness, criminality, and other forms of excess in fiction, film, and art, entitled Disorderly Portraits, Images of Excess from Balzac to Freud to Silence of the Lambs. Her talk today references some of the ideas that she's developing in this work, so your responses and questions following the talk will be of particular interest to her. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Harter to the lectern for her talk on art and the poetics of failure.
I'm truly grateful and privileged to be able to speak as part of the Scientia lecture series this year on failure. And I'm so delighted. Susan wished to allow the humanities and arts to fail right along with all the other fields this year. Let me just begin by saying that when we think very hard about something that we're interested in, for me, it is art and fiction. What do they do? What are they? We often think about what they are not. Your son is going off to college, and you say, well, son, it's not high school. And your daughter's going to Morocco, and you say, it's not London. For me, as I have thought about art, I have tried to ask myself what it is, what it isn't, and I've thought about science and why it is very different from science. And as I've done that, I've come up with 3 conclusions that I would like to share with you today. The first is that oppositions are tricky. They tend to be too simple. And the more I've looked at art and science, the more they have not seemed very different. The second conclusion is that if there is one way in which they are different, it might actually be in their relationship to failure. That in all the other ways, somehow they're always coming together, but this is one place where they really are different. Thirdly, as I looked more and more about the idea of failure in art and how it was different from failure in science, I began to realize that I might have come upon the thing that is absolutely essential to art from whatever perspective, with whatever comparison we make, that there's something about failure and art that is fundamental to it. Not long ago, one of my colleagues, Jeff Kreipel, and I, he's in religious studies, were talking about the differences and how the one is about numbers and the other one's about words. One's about measurement and experiment, and the other one's about representation. One of them is looking at nature. The other one is thinking about dreams and love and death and the ineffable. How one of them, frankly, is science, and the other one, fiction. And yet we non-scientists, it seems to me, focus so much on the ways in which science is a bastion of the certain, the real, and the true, figuring that truth is its special province, that we make that truth responsible for too much. We forget that in the empirical world, measurement is rarely perfect. We forget that our scientists themselves are careful to speak more in caveats and probabilities than in certainties. And in an absolutely marvelous lecture just the other day, Paul Padley, who was talking about failure on an epic scale in physics, he explained that he and his colleagues have a few clues about what's going on out in space, but in fact, they rarely know why it's going on the way it's going on. And about 90% of the stuff they measure as it's flying about, they don't know what it is. It's quite wonderful to hear him, and as we do so many of our scientists, talking as much about what they don't know as about what they do. We forget especially that great science, just like great art, is generated from extraordinary acts of imagination. Our scientists may love precision and precise rules, Kepler's laws, Descartes' method, Newton's principles, but the brilliance in their work comes from the curiosity and the imaginative reflection that precedes measurement, and from their irrepressible love of the playful act of solving problems. And to give you just one small example, I'll never forget years ago at UC Berkeley walking into a math lecture, and there were about 10 minutes before it began, and I looked around and suddenly I saw that almost every single person in the room was doing the Rubik's Cube, which had just come out. I was shocked, and they were doing it. A couple of them even continued after the talk began. Most of them stopped. And they were doing it because it had just come out. It had nothing to do with their math, but every single one of them had to figure out that damn Rubik's Cube. I had just been, the day before, to a really marvelous lecture on romantic poetry, and I can assure you, not one person in the audience was doing the Rubik's Cube. As for truth, scientists have very little use for such terms. When they get excited about a particular theorem or a proof, they don't call it true. They call it beautiful or elegant. In fact, the other day, I thought I would just double-check this, and I Googled mathematical proofs. And there it was. I was shocked. According to Alexander Bogomolny, let me see if I can do this right. Mathematical proofs are of two broad categories, simple and charming. You'd think this was a humanist talking. Some mathematical statements, he said, hold some secret, being counterintuitive to most or surprising, and these are attractive facts. So here's my first conjecture. Scientists are actually closet artists. It is at the same time, just as we look for truth to mean too much in science, we strain so hard to find beauty in the art that we witness, beauty to which we feel entitled, figuring that beauty is art's special province, maybe even its only province, that we make beauty responsible for way too much. We forget that art, like science, is often a matter of analysis and a matter of experiment. And we forget that however true it is that art often appeals to our senses, we ourselves are not always, or at least not always immediately, its best judges. Al Capp once quipped that abstract art is a product of the untalented, sold by the unprincipled to the utterly bewildered. And the great American painter John Sargent once complained that every time he painted a portrait, he lost a friend. Indeed, some of the greatest works of art of all time, in music, in literature, in art, in film, have been enormous for the way in which they were experimental, the way in which they were bold. And I'd like to begin by thinking first about Walt Disney's Fantasia that came out in 1940. I'm sure all of you know Fantasia. And my guess is that you think it's one of the greatest films, certainly the greatest animated film ever made, that it's exquisite. In fact, can we think of anything as good as Fantasia? I don't know that we can. I haven't seen all the recent ones. And yet, when it came out, it was an absolute flop. It was a flop at the box office. It almost bankrupted Walt Disney and the company. Since then, people say that it was one of the boldest and most creative artistic accomplishments in the history of film. An astonishing mix of Hollywood and conceptual art that pushed every artistic boundary. According to the American writer Otis Ferguson, one of the strange and beautiful things that have happened in the world. Oh, goodness, you forgot to tell me to change the picture. This is Fantasia. Imagine a picture like this in 1940, animated. Just as failed as this, when we go to the domain of painting, is Picassos Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And I know I have several art historians in the room and even a couple of very fine artists, and they will all agree that when this painting came out in 1907, it shocked the art world. It made people angry. It departed radically from the traditional European traditions that came before. It abandoned all use of perspective. Its surface was flat and two-dimensional. The women it depicted were not alluring, but menacing. And it led to wide anger even among Picasso's friends. Today, of course, it's considered not just the beginning of several new schools, but one of the most dramatic of all turning points in the history of modern art. In the realm of music, most of you will recognize, when I play it in just a minute, Tchaikovsky's first concerto for piano. It's a magnificent concerto, and you will quickly recognize it as one of the concertos that today is absolutely beloved. But this too, when it came out, I'll just tell you a little bit what people thought. 3 days after he finished writing it, Tchaikovsky played it for two of his musician friends, and they were both outraged. One of them insisting that it was worthless and unplayable, fragmented, clumsy, and so badly written as to be beyond rescue. In sum, a work that was bad and vulgar, of which only 2 or 3 pages were worth preserving. Let me just play it for you. I won't play the whole thing, but just a couple of minutes. I hate to turn it off. Actually, I'm not sure I know how to turn it off. Great, thank you.
It's a sign that says exit, and it goes on.
Dennis, you are the last one to complain. Okay.
Please go to your
So, right, so I'm right there. Perfect. All right. Well, you can certainly see why they complained that this was a bit unplayable. It looks unbelievable, an unbelievable piece to play. But imagine calling this bad and vulgar, and that's precisely what they thought. And those were great musicians who felt that it was bad. The quotation is from the musician, the pianist he was hoping would play it for the first time. To take, finally, an example from literature. Those of you who've studied French at all will know that Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, is one of the greatest collections of poetry of all time. Certainly one of the greatest in French, and for some of us, one of the greatest in any language. And yet at the time of its publication, it earned only a tiny group of admiring readers. For most, the volume was a perfect symbol of scandalous immorality. Baudelaire was fined and prosecuted for dealing an insult to public decency. Many of the poems were banned, and six of them were still banned until 1949. Quite astonishing. One critic would write, "Everything in it which is not hideous is incomprehensible. Everything one understands is putrid." Baudelaire would die at the age of 46, homeless and unable to speak, recognized for his notoriety rather than for his writings, and yet leaving for generations to follow a work of supreme beauty, a cornerstone of world literature, a modernism that anticipates every new wave of modernism. Both art and science, moreover, are driven, absolutely driven, by the threat of failure that is at the heart of all things human and that we have seen in every possible form in the course of this wonderful lecture series. For every restructured experiment in the lab, there are 100 pages of rejected rough drafts and failed drawings. It absolutely has the same relationship to that failure that we all feel all the time. For the artist and for the scientist, the student and the lover, the psychiatrist and the psychic, failure is equally detestable, however true it is, that it does indeed sometimes spark new ideas, mark off dead ends, generate better approaches. Konrad Lorenz once wrote that it is a good morning exercise for a research scientist to discard one pet hypothesis every day before breakfast. It keeps him young. And I have a friend who keeps, my academic friends will appreciate this, she keeps not just an updated CV, but an updated anti-CV, where she lists all of the prizes she didn't get that she applied for, all the fellowships where she was not a finalist, all the jobs that didn't pan out, the articles she wanted to write and didn't write. She shows it to her graduate students, and I understand it's incredibly encouraging to them. I would even go so far as to say that failure is so very central to human experience and expectation that its absence is frightening. And I'm sure all of you remember the film 2001: Space Odyssey. And when it first came out, I remember seeing it. And I remember how absolutely terrified I was when Hal, the computer, decides to take over the ship. How many of you remember seeing this film or have seen this film? And Hal is so incredibly polite, and his voice is very soothing. I may be able to get us on a little bit of a recollection of what that voice sounded like.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What a voice. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. Poor Dave is up in space. The computer's got control. And I would suggest that what is so terrifying about that moment is the fact that Hal is infallible, and that infallibility is simply uncanny, unhuman, inhuman, unfair. It was that was unimaginable. It was that was absolutely terrifying. But there is another kind of failure, and I come now in my talk to the kind of failure that is so important in art. And it is this one that will will be the subject of my words from here on out, and I hope if you'll try to keep it separate a little bit from the failure to which we are all used. It is that sense, and it's often recorded tangibly within the work of art itself, that if there is a truth to be found in our evocations of ourselves and the world, it is one to which we come closest when we barely suggest it, when we don't quite say it, when we don't finish the image utterly. An awareness that to pin down more perfectly than this the outlines of a thing is precisely to fail to capture it. When we do that, we shrink its necessary movement. We shrink what it is. We stop its movement. Now, this doesn't mean that every artist doesn't absolutely crave perfection, absolutely finishing that piece of work. And there's a favorite story of mine by Balzac, some of you will be familiar with. It's called Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu, the unknown masterpiece. And it's about this old artist, Fraunhofer, who is the greatest artist of his day, and he has two friends who come and they want him to look at their art, and he gives them a few thoughts, and he said, well, you know, it's just not very alive. It's a silhouette. It doesn't really turn around. It's heavy. And they say, well, let us look at your work. And he shows them a little bit of his work, just little pieces, and they're blown away. And he says, but of course, I'm working on my masterpiece, La Belle Noiseuse, a portrait that he says will be so wonderful, so incredible, and he's been working on it for 10 years, that when you look at it, she will almost seem to breathe. And you will think that at any moment she's going to step down from that canvas. And he's absolutely sure it will happen. It just takes time. And he says, and I love this quote, beauty, after all, is a severe and difficult thing. You have to wait for it, spy on it, hold it, and entwine it tightly until it gives in to you. At the conclusion of the story, he makes a deal with his friends. They let him see this gorgeous woman as a model to make that final stroke if he will show them the masterpiece. And he shows it to them. And he does make that final stroke. And they take a look at it, he unveils it, and all they see is this mass of line and color, layers of color upon color and lines and chaos, except right in a little corner, right out of the corner is this little tiny exquisite foot. It is a foot, and it is coming out, and it is so perfect, and it's just sort of emerging from the corner of their canvas. And as they're looking at it, Fraunhofer realizes that at the same time they've been disappointed, and he throws them out. And that night, he burns all his paintings and dies in the flames. Art and fiction and film and sculpture, every form of creative expression, is ever recording the necessary gap between what is possible to render and the thing itself. And what makes Fraunhofer, I would suggest, such a great artist is that he knows it's not quite finished. He knows that it's not quite finished, even as much as he believes it can be. Failure in art, I would suggest, is an awareness that is of a deficiency that is not just inevitable, but necessary. And if you look at this wonderful painting of Van Gogh's, it is called Portrait of a Patient in St. Paul's Hospital. And I'm not sure if the picture is coming out terribly well, but can you see the sort of wispy stuff about his head? You look at this portrait, and you sort of feel that sense in which it is not contained, it's not whatever it's doing, whatever its meaningfulness, whatever its absolute greatness, has to do precisely with the fact that those outlines are not very sure. So what does this failure come from in art? It comes first from the fact that art tends to talk about difficult stuff. Loneliness and grief and death and fear. And those are hard things to render. I suppose particles in space are hard to render, but I don't know. I still think love and death and fear are very hard to render. And anything that seems within itself, inside the work of art, to be confident that it has actually rendered it has probably not rendered it. The great literary critic Shoshone Fellman once said, for example, how difficult it is to say what madness is. What is it? How do you say it? How do you represent it in the literary text? But in the end, she suggests that it may be precisely and only in the literary text where it may be a little bit rendered. And what she says is, if it is true that the question underlying madness cannot be asked, that language is not capable of asking it, it is not less true that in the fabric of a text, the question is at work, stirring, changing place, and wandering away. The failure in art that I'm talking about also has to do with the inadequacy of language and of paint. The fact that language, however rich, can never quite say exactly what we wish to say. And I think one of the most beautiful renditions of this thought is the one of Flaubert that many of you, it's a rather famous citation, you probably will recognize it, although I've changed the translation just a little bit. What he says in Madame Bovary is that language is but a cracked kettle on which we beat out tunes that make bears dance just when we longed to move the stars to pity. Of course, this probably from my point of view, one of the greatest writers of prose in the history of any language. In fact, someone whose language often takes one's breath away. For those of you who have read Madame Bovary, Emma's husband, Charles, he's really not, he's not to blame in any way. He's not the reason his wife becomes adulterous. But he is quite bland. And Flaubert says, at one point, he says, his conversation was commonplace as a street pavement, and everyone's ideas trooped through it in their everyday garb, without exciting emotion, laughter, or thought. Notice that one of the great things about Flaubert is his use of metaphor. One way of not saying a thing, but also evoking it, is to say that it is something else. When Emma attends a ball at one point with her husband, it is an extraordinary ball, and it's full of aristocrats, and it's very new to her. And she's dancing, and it's so exciting, and she meets a very exciting man, and the floors are so gorgeous, they're even burnished with wax. And when she comes home, she's quite depressed, and she takes the slippers that she was wearing to the dance, and every day she takes them out of the closet, and she holds them. And there's no question but that this is the beginning of dreams that will be ruinous for her. And Flaubert says it perfectly. He says, her heart resembled them. In its contact with wealth, something had rubbed off. Something had rubbed off on it that could not be removed. Her great error in life, of course, is never, in my mind, that she commits adultery. It is her false illusions. Nothing is ever enough. Falling in love is not what she thought it would be. Marriage is not what she thought it would be. Even death will not be the romantic thing she thought it might be. And I'll just give you this last example. At the end of the first part of the novel, she's begun to feel a little remorseful about being married and tired of Charles, and they're moving, and she opens up a drawer and she pricks her finger on a piece of wire and she pulls it out, and it turns out that it is the wire of her wedding bouquet that is now dried, and she immediately throws it into the fire. And watch what Flaubert says about what happens at that moment. It flared up more quickly than dry straw. Then it was like a red bush in the cinders slowly shrinking away. She watched it burn. The little pasteboard berries burst. The wire twisted. The gold lace melted. And at last, the shriveled petals, fluttering like black butterflies at the back of the stove, flew up the chimney. And this image for me of these black butterflies, this is the marriage. These are all her illusions, also flying up the chimney. Failure in art has to do, finally, with the fact that every artistic image, whether verbal or visual, must be captured inside the boundaries of a frame. The framed painting, the literary persona, the case study, the figure caught in the camera lens, the symphony. And frames don't just capture what the artist has observed or imagined, but what he or she chooses to cut out. At the very moment the artist's text or canvas delimits a particular space, draws a line around its edges, it must also separate that space from everything that surrounds. It arrests its movement. I think I mentioned this earlier. It defines it. It controls it. It somehow names it. And it does this so that it can then allow us as readers or spectators to contemplate and to enjoy what is inside that frame with a certain pleasure or horror or heartbreak, like the voyeur with his eye pressed to a keyhole. And of course, the artist senses that this is no good, that frames are a problem and to be resisted. I'm sure all of you know what the most famous painting in the entire world is. What is the most famous painting in the entire world? The Mona Lisa. Isn't that amazing that we can say about anything that it is the most of everything? I apologize if the picture is not as great as we'd like. But when we look at the Mona Lisa, what is it? Why is it so famous? What is it so famous for? The smile. And why is the smile so famous?
No one else smiled.
Because no one else smiled. I didn't quite hear that. Say that again. Or someone else. What is it about the smile? We can't quite get it. We don't quite know what that smile is. Leonardo da Vinci has shaded the corners of the mouth just enough that the edges, the corners of the mouth are sort of fading off into shadows. We feel intuitively that this is a smile of significance. We wouldn't be so interested if this was not an interesting smile. But it's an interesting smile. We can't quite figure it out. And I would suggest that Da Vinci has captured what we love about this smile precisely by not capturing it utterly, by allowing it to speak somehow indirectly. It does speak to us. And if he had tried to make its outline more perfect, he would have lost what it is trying to say. Let me show you another image. Let's take a look at this image. When you see this image, what do you think? Just call out the words. What are some words you think of? Fear. Maybe paranoia. Maybe the child in us, things that go bump in the night. There's all sorts of stuff. It's a beautiful image, isn't it? And there's a whole bunch in it. Well, this is from a Time magazine, a beautiful Time magazine cover. I think their artists do a wonderful job. And the front of the magazine is this, Understanding Anxiety. And what I would suggest is the minute that we name a thing, it stops it. It shrinks it. Now what have we got? We've got the same image, but it's an image about anxiety, and the paranoia is gone, and the fright is gone. So much of that is gone. The best ways to cope, what scientists have learned, all of these things, not just the main frame, are framing this image. And even the word time is framing the image. We're expecting certain things. It's in the context of Time magazine. One thing that I love about the publisher of Time is that they've actually tried to escape that frame a little bit, as you can tell. Her head is in the way of that image, and that's what makes this image actually so wonderful. So once again, when you take a look at this image and the one of the Mona Lisa, naming a thing has a way of shrinking it. If there were a name to the Mona Lisa, it would be a little bit different. I'd like to go back just briefly to the Balzac story, the unknown masterpiece, and I'd like to explain the painting below it, and that was on your opening slide, is a painting by Picasso. Apparently, it's 100 years later, apparently he was haunted by Balzac's painting. There's some debate about whether this is actually Picasso, but I believe they've decided it was Picasso. Maybe our art historians can tell later. But it is, I place it here for a very specific reason. When we look at this story, the one about Fraunhofer, the artist, it is a disquisition. It is a disquisition on the artist's valiant idealism in wanting to capture the very soul of nature. But it is also a story about the impossibility of that. Fraunhofer sets for himself an impossible task. He wants to capture the image perfectly, and yet he also wants it to step down from the canvas. And in just the same way, when you think of the narrator of this story, he does precisely the same way. Same thing. He's trying to give us Fraunhofer, trying to explain who he is, trying to evoke him with descriptive flourish. But he can never quite get it right. At one point he says, well, he's a master painter. Then at another point, more poet than painter, more lover than painter, as much madman as painter. He goes back and forth. At another point, he'll be looking at Fraunhofer. He's talking to us about Fraunhofer, and he'll say that it was as though he were a portrait by Rembrandt, descended from his painting, bereft of his frame, and walking silently along and dragging with him his own dark atmosphere. The narrator literally turns Fraunhofer into a painting. And as you'll recall, Fraunhofer will burn all his paintings at the end of the story. In the same way, the narrator and Balzac himself have killed off Fraunhofer in that same moment. I'm reminded of something Brooke McEldowney said. She's one of the great modern comic artists. She said, a work of art is never really finished. It is abandoned. Just a few more words on this before I go to another part of my paper. I would like to say that we do still have that exquisite foot. It's still something. And yet this is a story in which one artist's aesthetics of perfection, the most exquisitely developed aesthetics one could imagine, comes face to face with the fundamental poetics of failure that is at the heart of every artistic enterprise. And the result, I would suggest, is captured perfectly when you think of Balzac's title. I've thought about it so often, The Unknown Masterpiece. There are a dozen reasons why you might call it The Unknown Masterpiece. But I'm now convinced that it is called this because the story captures in that little foot something that is a masterpiece, genuinely a masterpiece, even in that moment of failure. But it is also an unknown masterpiece. And that's why it's a masterpiece. The challenge of art is to say well, portray well, paint well, things that simply cannot be said entirely. And art's inevitable failure in this process is key to why it is precisely here, and only here, in the domain of art, that some things find their best expression. It is here, after all, that the failure of representation may itself be made visible. Baudelaire's rendering of the severed body in the beautiful poem Une Martyre, the martyr. Picasso of a weeping woman, Goya of Tio Pachetti, Van Gogh's portrait of the patient that we saw a moment ago, Balzac's rendering of La Belle Noiseuse, and Fraunhofer's rendering, Balzac's of Fraunhofer and Fraunhofer of La Belle Noiseuse, are all instances in which the image is not contained, the canvas not a source of stability, the poem not firmly rooted to the page. They move us in the end, not just for what they allow us to see, but for what they keep to themselves, for the explosive exit they ultimately register at the edge of the frame. The truth of fiction, I'm suggesting, and the real in art have a great deal to do with art's self-consciousness about the limitations of what it can express. Limitation inherent in the subjects it takes on, in the deficiency of language and of paint, in the cutting short ever practiced by the frame. It is the self-conscious of this, I would suggest. The fact that even the artist who believes he can reach that final stroke never recognizes in his or her final stroke a final stroke. It can't be done. The masterpiece in Balzac's tale is a masterpiece precisely because it is unknown. Failure in art, then, means not strangling one's object, either within the bounds of language or of paint or within the bounds of the frames we must use in order to convey them. We sense this in so much of art. Kafka has a beautiful story called Josefina the Singer, the Mouse Folk, and it is one in which the narrator is a mouse, Josefina is a mouse, and the narrator wants to know why Josefina thinks she's an artist, she's a singer, when it's absolutely sure that she pipes just like everybody else. And the entire story is the one mouse describing the piping, which is not a piping of the other mouse. A wonderful, wonderful story. In Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, the narrator starts right out from the beginning, and he says, I've got this story, and I'm not sure I can tell it. I can't give a full and satisfactory biography. And right to the end of the story, there's never a full and satisfactory biography. And I think also of Silence of the Lambs. I'm sure many of you have seen this extraordinary film. For those of you who haven't, I really do think it's quite a wonderful film. A little difficult to watch here and there, but do you remember why Clarice goes to talk to Hannibal Lecter? Why does the CIA send her there? It is to get his profile, to do a psychological profile, because they need to somehow get inside his head so that they can find out who the real killer is. Well, she gets there, and she never quite finishes. She never quite is able to make that profile. But who does make a profile? In fact, who is the one who will do a painting by the end of the story? And that's Hannibal, who will do a painting, a portrait of Clarice. From the beginning, as you look at this film, it is all about frames. You walk down into the dungeon. You have all the other prisoners in these cells, and you've got bars. They're very 19th century looking cells. Actually, Dennis once pointed out to me that when you're down there, you hear clanking. It's almost like a submarine. And then you get to Hannibal's cell. And this one's different because the bars seem to have disappeared. And he's standing there. This is our first view of him, standing there very, very straight. And it's as though the frame is gone, that it's glass. And this is, of course, very threatening to us. Chilton, the director of this prison, calls him his prize possession, insisting that he is a monster. Watch how he's trying to, Chilton, who's very stupid, wants to say what he is. He's a monster. Starling is a little smarter. Someone asks her at some point, what is he? And she says, they don't have a name for what he is. And I think precisely what is very frightening about this film is that you know that no matter what they do, remember when he's in that big room, he's got that giant cage around him, and the guy's coming up with his dinner, and you just know something really awful is going to happen. This is after they have put him into this special place. They've put this mask on him. He's in a straitjacket. There is no way you can keep Hannibal Lecter inside his cage. He won't befriend. He will get out every time. So what? To talk about art, and to talk about failure, to talk about its differences with science. I have told a few of my friends that many years ago when I was in an interview, my interviewer, Howard Block, a great medievalist, said to me after I told him about my dissertation, I thought I gave him a really great description of my dissertation. I really liked my dissertation, and I was so proud of myself. And he said, so what? What difference does it make? Why should I want to think about that? And so I'd like to think about that now a little bit. So what do we do with this failure, with this difference with science? And my answer, that it is is that it is, in fact, in this kind of failure that is art, in this enormously important place where one sees it working differently from science, that we find, in fact, the importance of science and art to each other over time as art, as knowledge accrues, as we try to figure things out, as we look around and describe and explore and articulate and discover what our universe is and who we are and what we're surrounded by. I would suggest that it is only through the subtle intertwining of the scientific and the aesthetic imagination, through the art of the scientific imagination and the truth of fiction working closely over time, but in patterns that are not always immediately visible, that knowledge can ever move forward. As the scientist measures and quantifies, he or she is careful to move forward only to the degree he or she can be absolutely sure. And if this can sometimes be a little slow, it's precisely what takes us from phrenology to neuroscience. The frames that constrain the artist, on the other hand, are far more permeable, which means that the artist is far less sure of what he or she is expressing, but is also often able to leap way ahead of the game. And I'd like to look very briefly at the history of madness in the 19th century. This is a time when science is trying to figure out what it is, to name it. It's the birth of phrenology and monomania, and where literature and art are also capturing it in paint and in fiction. And just to give you a very few quick senses of it, this is actually, have I skipped one? This is Gaulle, who in 1776 would develop the science of cranioscopy. This would later become phrenology. You've all perhaps heard of Johann Caspar Lavater, who in 1803, and he was a physiognomicist, and he would try to find little bits and things about the body that would allow us to judge qualities. And for example, on the left, it's called chiffre de la folie. It's the sign of madness. And what that sign is, it's quite wonderful. If you can read the French, it says that whoever stands upright with one lip just to the side and holds himself absolutely straight and still is mad. And I actually love this because this is what we see in Hannibal, if you'll recall. On the other one, it's the mole of voluptuousness. If you have a little hair coming out of a mole, this is a sign of a kind of voluptuous nature in you. This is rage, according to Lavater in 1792. This is a maniac with anger. Now, what I'm showing you are illustrations from science. This is from Esky Hall, one of the great science illustrators, and he did this for very important work on mental alienation, as they called it in those days, by Philippe Pinel. Phrenology became very popular from about 1810 to 1840. And then Charles Bell. Wonderful. Oh, Charles Bell is quite extraordinary. He would publish a book. He illustrated it himself. It was a guide to medical illustration. And he would tell us how to do things. So this is what fear is, for example. And this is rage. And he would tell us, for example, that to illustrate fear, the eyeball should be largely uncovered. Let me go back to fear. The eyes staring, the eyebrows elevated to the utmost stretch. With a DeMano Maniac, all the muscles are rigidly contracted, the lower limbs extended, the eyes are distorted, the teeth are grinding. I'm afraid I don't have his illustration here for the DeMano Maniac. This is his rendering of rage. This is madness. Notice the chains and the nudity. 1878, Cesare Lombroso, really famous Italian criminologist, he would write that the criminal's irresponsible craving for evil could be read anatomically in his or her enormous jaws and high cheekbones. In 1890, this is actually a real photograph. I asked Susan about this, and Susan is an archaeologist. I said, why does he have ridges on his head, on his forehead? Can you see the ridges on the forehead? I guess Those are just the lines. Those are just the lines on his face that are still there when he's dead. I guess those lines never go away. This is a demonic attack, 1885. Now, from the school of Charcot, look at the way in which madness is being described, is being envisioned by the scientific imagination, working very hard to understand it. And let me now go to some of the things we see in art. I'd like to go to 5 paintings. Actually, I've just got 3 here today, by the wonderful painter Théodore Géricault. We call them his portraits of the insane. They are from the 1820s, and they are unlike anything I had ever seen so early in the century. This is his monomania of gambling. These are portraits taken of inmates from the 2 major asylums in Paris. This is monomania of theft. Look how these are real people. These are real people, and their gaze is coming out of the picture, and they look back at us. This is monomania of envy. She was apparently called the hyena. And this, in 1882, Van Gogh, Sorrow. But let me go back to Géricault and just say that I'm getting behind in my paperwork. I'm always getting behind in my paperwork. We're seeing images where the eyes are not bulging, the faces emerge with a frank realism. They're not just objects of our gaze. And they are also a wonderful juncture of art and science, because on the one hand, you see that image at the bottom of the image. You can't see it, it's too small. But it is written, monomanie de l'envie, monomania of envy. Because this is what this particular patient was suffering from in her asylum. And when I looked at these pictures, I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, we have science and art framing this image all at once. And it was really quite exciting for me in the beginning of my current project. Now, I may have said, and this is my conclusion, that the project of science is to refine our knowledge of the world with the tools of reason and experiment in a pattern of methodical climb rather than leaps and bounds. But this is by no means to say that science is not witness as well to revolutionary thinking and astonishing movements forward. Apparently, physics was almost done at the end of the 19th century, and then Einstein and Bohr and others discovered quantum mechanics. And while the project of art is to conceive and to construct images, whether or not these impact what we know, this is not to say that within the very bounds of fiction, in the very context of objects and ideas only partially captured, there isn't enormous truth. If sacred texts are moving for their ability to inspire the earthly with windows onto the divine, and if philosophical texts further our moral understanding in the domain of logic and reason, fiction speaks to us when it captures the contingencies in life, the choices that must be made, and the consequences subsequently felt. There's something about great fiction that makes it difficult for us to condemn in blanket fashion the adultery of Emma Bovary, that asks us whether we have struggled with such emotions as those of Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, that provides a glimpse into Ahab's obsession in Melville's Moby Dick and asks what that might have to do with us. And for those of you who've read Moby Dick, one wonderful thing, what happens in Moby Dick, at the end, how does Ahab die? But trying to capture Moby Dick, and his harpoon is connected to a chain, and the chain, as Moby Dick rushes off, the chain catches around his leg and takes him right down along with the whale. And of course, on the forehead of the whale, the way he recognizes this whale is that there are all these marks. They're actually scars, and they look like hieroglyphs. Wonderful novel. And of course, I think of another wonderful or more comical image of 2 snails. There's a wonderful poem by Jacques Prévert. It's called 2 Snails on Their Way to a Wedding. I'm sorry. No, it's 2 snails on their way to a funeral. I got that. All literature ends either with death or marriage, so it's all the same. But it's about two snails on their way to a funeral, and it's a wonderful poem. And they're going in, they've got black lace draped between their two corns, and they go very slowly, and it takes them a whole long time to get there, and then it's a terrible disappointment because they get there and spring has come and the leaf has been resuscitated. Nor does fiction merely help us to negotiate the contingencies we regularly face in a world that doesn't always make sense or just give us images that we can carry with us. It also expresses horrors and joys and suffering that are otherwise unspeakable. There is a redemptive power. In the stories we tell each other and in the stories we read, they give a name to the heartache that moves us. They give us a place to be and from which to view the world. They provide the beginnings we have forgotten and the endings we cannot witness to the narratives that are our own lives. I'm suggesting that among our most compelling sources of knowledge are the stories we read. Good fiction brings together in rich and complex and often ambiguous ways characters and settings and actions and emotions and time that together create a response in us that is a synthetic process as much as anything else. It derives its power from the internal richness and internal coherence of what it has to say. Fiction that is lacking in this fails to have an impact on us. And only such power as this moves us to reflect on ourselves and the world in new ways. Jaco's monomaniacs, like Balzac's Fraunhofer and Melville's Bartleby, Maupassant's Madame Hermé, Kafka's Josephina, ultimately defy the frames that seem so conveniently to contain them, fail to say perfectly who they are, and it is in this defiance that they belong to art. And I really am almost done, just a couple more paragraphs. I began today by suggesting that science and art often appear to us as opposing entities. One of them is often, and erroneously, considered a conglomerate of hard fact, the other a cloud of soft dreaming. One of them analytical, the other imagistic. One concerned to describe the natural world, the other more interested in taking the measure of the human. But I have tried to suggest as well that great science, just like great art, often begins with formidable acts of imagination, and that art, just like science, is a product of reason and experiment. And while I still maintain their relation to failure is a different one, of course, Paul Padley really messed me up the other day with his speech, because with his lecture, he said so beautifully how the scientist does what he or she does because certainty, even for the scientist, is ever elusive. But we'll forget about that. I still think I can argue against it. Not quite the same failure. They have in common, moreover, the fact of being anchored in mortal scholarship. And we mortals, as we all know, whether we are measuring the surface of a small body of water or painting its image, really do have no choice but to work in a way that blends the subjective with the objective, what we actually see and what we hope to see. I would suggest, indeed, that it is the science in art that makes of it a dynamic and changing record of the human imagination, and that it is the art in science that allows it to undergo regular revolutions in its thinking. It is the difference between them, moreover, that underlie their importance to each other in uncovering the contours of the human, as they did in the 19th and 20th centuries in the domain of mental pathology. We need the scientist in Freud to articulate for us with the force of reason and analysis the critical notion of the unconscious mind, just as Freud needed the imaginative fictions of Dickens and Dostoevsky and Edgar Allan Poe and Maupassant to suggest, but vaguely and indirectly in the years preceding, the possibility of such a structure of mind. We are delighted to hear how computational models are being developed to theorize linguistic evolution, and how radiological science weaves together the exigencies both of experimentation and of representation. I also said at the opening of this talk that both science and art are driven by their wish to avoid and to benefit from the instigating power of failure. But if failure, for science, is a thing to be left behind in a process that is a gift to all of us for its meticulous climb, its ever pushing forward into new realms, new inventions, new understanding of how the world works, the special gift of art is its expansion not just forward, but also back. The humanist may study again and again, and with always rich result. And you have in front of you a wonderful work from the 16th century, and of course, something by Picasso from the 20th. The humanist may study again and again, and with always rich result. The very same passage in Shakespeare, the very same portrait of Moses. The novels of Flaubert and Dickens and George Eliot and Stendhal gave way in the 20th century to the novels of Proust and Woolf and Joyce, but they are not less great novels for that. The measured lyrics of the well-shaped romantic poem gave way eventually to the free verse of poetry that shed every formal pattern of rhythm and rhyme. But all this only means a greater field of study for the humanist, for whom Baudelaire's Death of Lovers and Shakespeare's Othello will never cease to produce new commentary, and for whom Homer's Iliad will always have something more to say about war between men. It is only indeed for the bigness, the vastness of what the artist takes on that this may be true. And it is only its poetics of failure that ensures its message is never complete. Balzac's unknown masterpiece is precisely a masterpiece for not being fully known, and a parable for the brilliance and the importance and the relevance every single day of the most outdated of man's imaginative expressions. Art inhabits our past and pushes into our future with equal measure. Every mediocre text or image will certainly be forgotten over time. But the greatest imaginative and intellectual expressions in fiction and in philosophy, in art and film and photography, merely ensure that the backward stretch of the truth of art, the truth of all those things that are merely a fiction, will forever add to the forward scope of men's thinking. Thank you very much.
I have to speak into her microphone because we're videoing this.
Yes.
And so I want to thank you for that stunning humanist manifesto. It is one, as we all recognized, and it was fabulous. And so now she would like to hear your questions, but I'm going to let her call on you, and you will have to repeat the question. Otherwise, we have no way to hear it on the video machine, okay?
Wonderful.
All right.
Well, I will love to take a few questions. If someone needs to go, they're welcome to. And also, if anyone would like to stop by my apartment afterwards for a glass of wine, they are also welcome to do that. We weren't able today to have our usual reception outside. Any questions, thoughts about science, about art? Yes?
You mentioned that Flaubert's Les Fleurs du Mal was roundly condemned at its time, and that he died unknown and ruined. What bearing do those facts have on whether the work was a failure or not, given that it was a masterpiece?
That is a really wonderful question. So Donna has asked, why is it that, or what does it mean that Baudelaire wrote something that was absolutely a failure in its own time, and now it's not? Does that have some bearing on whether it is a masterpiece? It's a wonderful question. I think it gets to the whole notion of masterpiece. It gets to that notion about whether or not any of us is actually in a position to say what is great art. Remember, one of the things I said was we seem to feel that we're entitled to beauty in art, and we don't always get it. We just don't always get it. There are wonderful things that we don't get at first. I do think, however, that over time, that there is a way in which time does tell. Great poetry and great music, like Tchaikovsky, like Fantasia, like Baudelaire, will eventually, and it's often because the artist is ahead of his or her time. And at some point there will be an audience. And if there is no audience, if that never happens, then I think I might, although I have two wonderful, genuine artists in the room, I don't know what they would say. I don't know if we could say that that is not art. I would never want to go so far as to say that. But certainly, greatness in art, the only thing I would like to say is that it is not necessarily linked to what we, the observer, think, and certainly not what we, the observer, think at that moment. Wonderful question. Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
I'm trying to get clear about what the main idea of the talk, wonderful, very suggestive, which talk was. And I was trying to articulate in this way, perhaps paradoxically, that those works of art that we could say are successful are precisely those that fail at containing or framing themselves fully, and they are somewhat transcendent beyond, we use the word defines. And I was wondering if that's correct, and if that's the case, then isn't there a language for that defiance that it is brought up in, and that's the cause of analysis?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and for those of you who don't know Fernando Casas and his sister Becky, these are really exceptional artists who have beautiful artwork on display around the city. And his question is, he's thinking about this notion of art that what I had said about the way it is, the content of the artistic work is escaping the frame, and you're wondering whether there is a language that actually allows for that. I think you would be the person to answer that question. I would love to know what you think, but my guess is that just as Flaubert creates metaphor as a way to tell us precisely that agony, that disillusionment when she sees those black butterflies go up that chimney, Flaubert makes us feel what she's feeling, precisely what she's feeling at that moment, by saying it in a different way. He has not said it, but he makes us feel it. And in that sense, his metaphor is a kind of language for that escape. And I would think, although I'm not as familiar with painting, I would think that this is precisely what you do, that when Da Vinci shaded and sort of smudged the shadows right around the corners of the mouth of the Mona Lisa, that is a kind of language, a way of not allowing it to be too sure. But I would love to know if you had more to say about that. What I don't want to say is that this is a failure that is like other kinds of failure. This is a failure that is exquisite failure. It's the failure of coming up with that image, that one image of the woman who's apparently anxious and not writing anxiety. It is a failure that is simply an allowing. It is what Fraunhofer thinks he needs, one last brushstroke, and it is because there is no single moment when it is done. It's too rich for that. It's too big. Anyway, any other questions? And if not, I would sure like to thank all of you very much for coming, and thank Scientia and Susan. Thank you so much.
Yes.